Money, power, culture. If you asked me to sum up in 3 words what I think the entire Trump administration is all about, I'd say exactly those 3 things. More specifically, I'd say it is all about the titanic struggle over who gets to control taxpayers' money to take the power to control the culture, and in doing so drive the agenda for the United States and in some ways the world. Now, if you think about it, these big principles are largely the reason why Donald Trump returned to power last year. It was a reaction against what has been called the Great Awakening that began under the Obama administration and continued under Joe Biden. Well, I want to tell you now about a big win for the Trump administration this week, which, let me tell you, has been in need or two of a win or two. Essentially, the Trump team managed to unplug 2 major government-funded broadcasters, NPR and PBS, from the taxpayer teat. Now, to suggest that these 2 institutions, NPR and PBS, are left-wing is an understatement. In fact, these 2 outfits would make, say, Radio National in Australia look like Russia Today. Allow me to give you a few examples of what we're talking about here, because what they have been up to has been pretty wild. Let's start with a biggie. Back in 2020, NPR, or National Public Radio, refused to cover the Hunter Biden laptop story. They said they didn't want to waste their time covering stories that were not real stories. Well, how did that change? But in fact, they also spent considerable time going personally after Emma Jo Morris, a regular guest on this program, who was one of the key drivers, along with Miranda Devine, of the story at the New York Post. As well, not surprisingly, they bought the whole Russia collusion hoax hook, line, and sinker. Though, as we might talk about later, there have been some new developments in that. Plus, they suggested that the thumbs up emoji, I love this story, they said the thumbs up emoji we all use on our phones is actually racist. And this was one of my favorites. In 2020, amidst the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter riots that rocked the United States, NPR ran this piece in defense of looting. Among other things, the so-called expert they spoke to said, quote, "Looting does a number of important things. It gets people what they need for free immediately, which means that they are capable of living and reproducing their lives without having to rely on jobs or a wage," unquote. Yes, that's right. You really need an armload of Air Jordans or a flat-screen TV to feed your hungry kids. Now, one of our favorites here, Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, broke this down even further on the floor of the Capitol.
I want to give you a few examples of stories that NPR has published using taxpayer money. I'll just read the headlines. First headline, NPR News Service. Michael Avenatti, quote, "a profile of the media-savvy attorney." They love Michael Avenatti. You know where Michael Avenatti is today? He's in jail. You know why? He's a crook.
Oh, and he wasn't done yet. There was more.
How racism became a marketing tool for country music. I kid you not. Monuments and teams have changed names. Let me say it again. Monuments and teams, presumably sports teams, have changed names as America reckons with racism. Birds are next. I don't know any birds that are racist. Eating less beef is a climate solution. Eating less beef is a climate solution. I don't have anything against vegetarians. I'm a semi-vegetarian myself. I eat beef and cows eat grass. So that makes me a semi-vegetarian. But that's my choice. not on NPR, eating less beef is a climate solution. Here's why that's hard for some American men. How the Taliban adds to Afghanistan's woes when it comes to climate-fueled disaster. Boy, I can tell you that's on the mind of every person in Afghanistan today.
And I mean, that's the thing. You could go on all night with this insanity. And I'll tell you what Kennedy almost did there. He listed story after insane story. I mean, National Public Radio claimed President Biden's presidential performance in his debate didn't change the election days before he dropped out of the race. They reported that there is no evidence that biological men have an unfair advantage over biological women in sports. And NPR also called America's interstate highways racist and said rural Americans were Christian nationalists, whatever that means. They even once issued a trigger warning for the Declaration of Independence. This is the mentality we're dealing with here, and this is a mentality that's just been defunded. Now, of course, the people behind NPR and PBS said that this was all nonsense, and their institutions were not biased. This is the head of NPR.
As far as the accusations that we're biased, I would stand up and say, please show me a story that concerns you, because we want to know and we want to bring that conversation back to our newsroom.
And the head of PBS sang a similar tune.
We are very much committed to serving all of America. The news programming that we do represents about 10% of our broadcast schedule, and that includes the News Hour, of which I'm very proud of the excellence of the journalism of that series. We're always interested, obviously, in making sure that we're serving a multiplicity of viewpoints. You know, Bill Buckley made his home on public broadcasting with a series called Firing Line, which continues today with Margaret Hoover.
Well, that's interesting, you know, because to cite Firing Line and its original host, William F. Buckley, who was an absolutely pioneering conservative writer and broadcaster and bon vivant, I must say, who sadly died in 2008, as the only thing you've got by way of conservative programming, well, that's a real tell. But all this underlines two very important points that are germane both in the U.S. and here in Australia. One, the taxpayer should not simply be on the hook for any of this stuff. The idea that you are ever going to have a neutral, publicly funded broadcaster is nonsense. And if you did manage to achieve that, well, guess what? Whatever it came up with would be so unwatchably boring, you could show it to root canal patients in lieu of anesthesia. But there's another point here, too, and that's about the nature of modern liberalism. You know, when I was a kid in the U.S., we had PBS and NPR, and yeah, sure, they were kind of squishy, granola, urban lefty operations, but nobody but cranks in those days seemed to complain because they also had fun, good stuff, too, like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, and cooking shows like Julia Child. But then somewhere along the way, well, they went frankly nuts. I think this happened around the time Barack Obama convinced them that the arc of history bent towards their being in power forever, and they decided that they could go as far as they wanted and tell us what they really think, not only what they think, but what we should think. And so this is what it all comes back to, and why defunding operations like NPR and PBS are so important for the Trump administration. In fact, it's why the whole cultural agenda is so important. It's not just culture wars, because what we're seeing is a pushback against the utter inability of left liberalism to put any limits, any governors on itself, even when they have gone so far off the rails that is obviously self-destructive. If NPR had pursued its ideological agenda maybe to 80% level rather than essentially 100%, well, they wouldn't be in this position now where they've had the plug pulled from them. But, as so often happens, they just couldn't help themselves. As one commentator pointed out, it's like a dictator who rigs the election at 100-0 rather than the far more plausible 75-25 or some such. And now, as I say, the plug is being pulled. Good. This is a big win for the taxpayer and a big win for Trump in a week when both could use a break.